Welcome to this episode of The Good, The Bad and The Odd One Out with your host Mark. Today I'd like to talk about a pair of films from the early 70s, vampire movies, Blacula and Scream. Blacula, Scream. Blacula came out in 1972. It was part of the sort of general blaxploitation, early blaxploitation era of classic era of blaxploitation, where you had great films coming out like Shaft, Coffee, things like that. This was, I think, the first horror entry into that cycle. There were ones after this, for example, Blackenstein. There was a black version of The Exorcist called Ruby, which I understand is quite good. I've never see it anywhere, so never seen it. But this was kind of quite a good film. I was surprised how good it was. It stood up very well. I think it was the DVD, but if it was DVD or Blu-ray, whatever it was, it looked really nice. The film stock was that early 70s look. It was really sharp and nice, not too colourful, kind of a little washed out in terms of colour, but otherwise absolutely crystal clear and sharp. And one of the real good things about this film, both films in fact, is the lead. William Marshall was the name of the actor that took the lead, and he who played Blacula. It starts off with him in 150 years ago in Dracula's castle, talking to Dracula, and they're talking about ending the slave trade. But then Dracula says something inappropriate about wanting to buy his wife, or something like, he said, "I'll buy your wife if I could," and all this. And then it all kicks off, and Dracula gets annoyed and attacks them, and puts the bite on him and says he curses him to a live in hell. And I think they encase him in a tomb to be hungry, ravenous for blood forever. But it turns out that coffin gets found, gets sent to America, and no one looks in it. A couple of gay interior designers buy it, and then Dracula comes out and puts the bite on them. Blacula comes out and puts the bite on them. Now, William Marshall was a very commanding presence in this. He's got a really great speaking voice. James Earl Jones kind of great. Really sort of deep, not quite a baritone, but very deep and commanding and very well spoken man. And that adds a real class to this picture. And it's funny, everyone's kind of talking jive and stuff like that, but there's him striding for all this, and there's kind of dig his clothes and stuff like that. The film powers along at a good pace. He's putting the bite on people, and basically everyone he bites turns into a vampire too, so they're sort of multiplying quite rapidly. And people get onto this and start worrying, think actions start happening. But essentially what he's doing, he's found a woman that looks like his long lost wife, and he thinks he's like, she should become his wife, but she has to do it by choice. He insists she has to do it by choice. He's not going to coerce her, and he lets her have that choice. He gives her time to think about it, but in the meantime he's putting the bite on people. There's all sorts of things happening. Right, in there, the film goes at a good pace, and there's some nice interesting stuff in it. Apparently Marshall insisted that this wasn't just a cheap rip-off. He wanted to give this character backstory. He was like a black prince of his tribe, or an elder of his tribe. I'm trying to think what his name was. It was something like Mwumbi. No, I'm going to mess this up. I can't remember his name. But it was really, really, really well done, and I think that gave it a bit of depth, which extended into Blacula Scream quite well, which I'll talk about when I get onto that. What I did also like about this is the actual vampire attacks, or the bits leading to vampire, were really well done, creepy. It reminded me an awful lot of Count Yorga Vampire, that kind of early 70s vampire film. Really well done, really enjoyed it. And I think you have to ignore the title when you consider this film. It does sound like a cheap, silly exploitation film, which, alright, they're all exploitation films, but it had something about it that made it really quite worthwhile. I would say it's worth watching because of that brilliant central performance by William Marshall, and the quite striking looking vampire attacks. There's one bit where a woman, a lady vampire, runs down a corridor with her hair basically back combed up, sticking up in the air with like big fangs, slowly running towards the camera. Really well done, really nice. I like, and I also like the resolution, which I don't know. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it had a really nice way it resolved that was kind of unusual for vampire films. Instead of it being confrontational, it wasn't. I mean, there was confrontation, but it was kind of a sadder resolution. I liked it. I'm not going to say what happened, but I liked it. I'd give it 65 out of 100. It wasn't great, but it was good, solid horror movie. Okay, that brings us to the next film. This sort of led to a sequel made a year later. Scream, Blacula. Oh, there was one other thing I wanted to mention. In the first one, they have some great music. There's bits where people are in a nightclub and there's some music, and there's pretty good music. Anyway, we get to Scream, Blacula, Scream. He gets resurrected by someone who wants revenge. Now, Scream, Blacula, Scream, it's a bit of a paradox. I'd put it on about the same score as the first one, but for different reasons. This one has dull bits. There's dead bits. And it's and Pam Grier's in it as one of the main characters. And she puts in a really flat, non-acting performance, as it were. She's really quite poor in it. I've never seen her poor in anything else. I was very surprised she was like this in this film. But William Marshall comes back. He's really good. But however, making up for all that flat stuff is there's some really great other bits. There's, again, vampire attacks that are really cool. There's some really interesting scenes, which I'll kind of go through in a bit, that I think add to the depth again. And again, it doesn't quite resolve how you think it's going to. But the resolution they were kind of suggesting, which doesn't happen, was a really interesting approach as well. Blacula's a driven person, and it's weird how he completely embraces his vampire side, but he can be a real thinker, and he believes he can do good, and it's kind of interesting. But having said that, all of that good stuff that elevates it above the first film is pulled down again by the quite dull, flat bits that happen in other bits of the film. One of the interesting things about the second film was that they introduced voodoo as a significant element, which I thought was kind of cool. Harkers back to the sort of the non-European sort of side of supernatural creatures, which I thought was quite kind of cool. There's even a few funny scenes that sort of riff on vampirism and black culture. There's one bit this guy gets turned and he's like a real dude, thinks he looks really great. He's one of those guys. And he gets turned into a vampire, then he puts on all these clothes that look dreadful, but he obviously thinks they're good. Proper pimp outfit kind of thing. And he goes and looks in the mirror, can't see himself, and he's really peeved that he can't see himself in the mirror. It's kind of funny. And he's bad-mouthing Blacula, saying, "Why'd you do this to me? I can't see." But then Blacula says, "If you talk to me like that again, I will rip your heart out." The bloke just shuts up. Anyway, Blacula goes on. More and more vampire. He gets another little vampire crew, which is fine. And there's one interesting scene later in the film where he lines them all up and tells them this woman, who's Pam Grier, is under his protection. She should not be touched. And he actually says something like, "Now leave me. The sight of you sickens me." He obviously does not like them. They're hissing vampires. He doesn't like them. He can't. I think it reminds him of that side of his nature, and it's not only them he doesn't like that bit of himself, but I think he actually literally does not like them either. It's not just a projection. He sees their fault. They're not obviously not intelligent or have his sort of abilities, have his way of seeing things. They just want blood, and he can kind of see that. There's some great vampire attacks in this as well. Again, they look really well. There was one bit where like a cop's walking through this house, and suddenly one swoops from behind him. Who's wearing this vampire's wearing a cow, and they're obviously on he's on a runner because he's not running, he just glides into the cop from behind. It's really quite cool, and there's lots of things like that. There was another scene that was kind of interesting too. I'm sure William Marshall had a lot to do with this scene, where he's walking along and this woman's standing there and she wants some company. She's obviously a prostitute, and it's kind of funny that she's not dressed like a prostitute. She's dressed like in a very, high collared dress. It looks like a business dress kind of thing, or business suit. And when he sort of doesn't understand, what do you mean? She says, oh, never mind, it goes off. But these two pimps then come along and say, hey, don't you like our girls and all this sort of stuff, and start giving him crap. And saying things like, clothes like that, you gotta be loaded and all this. And he just looks at them and he says, you act like slaves by imitating your slave masters. Have some self-respect, something like that, before he kills them both, because they try and stab him. Well, they do stab him, but he doesn't know. But it's kind of an interesting, telling thing to say. I thought it was really interesting. There's stuff like African artifacts being discussed, the nature of voodoo's being discussed. There's a few characters I've seen in other films, but I can't quite place them. One of them, I think, he's only in it briefly, is one of the guys that was in Live and Let Die. I think Live and Let Die had a few people from Blaxploitation films in it. And I remember him as the cabbie in Live and Let Die when he says, hey, Jim, get relaxed, Jim, when James Bond gets locked into the back of a yellow cab. I'm pretty sure it was him, but he was only in it really briefly, so I can't be sure. And also there was the guy, one of the white guys in it was one of the detectives who was working with this black detective to sort of solve the case. He was the guy that became the sergeant in the first run of Hill Street Blues. So he had a bit of hair then, not much, but a bit. It was kind of interesting to see him. There were some poor performances in this, but William Marshall really commands the screen. It was a shame Pam Grier didn't come off better in this. It's an interesting engine, and I just like the voodoo aspect of it. I thought it was a good idea. I'd recommend both these films. I'd rate them about the same. They're not great, but they're pretty good, mid-60s, and they're worth a watch. It's a shame. I've noticed on IMDb the second one seems to be rated as like a turkey of a film, but it's not that. There's some good stuff in it, and there's a little gold in them there heels. It's worth having a look for you and judging for yourself. Okay then, bye.